Let's stay with this theme. The U.S. has vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. 13 member states voted in favor of a brief draft resolution yesterday, while the UK abstained. The vote came after the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, deployed the rarely used Article 99 on Wednesday, formally warning the 15-member council of a global threat emanating from the 2-month-long war. For more on this discussion, we're now joined by Dr. Usuf Chikte, who speaks for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Coalition in South Africa, as well as Zionist Federation spokesperson Rolene Marks. A pleasure to have you both on the program this evening. Dr. Chikte, I'll start with you. How does the BDS Coalition view the recent U.S. veto of the UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and what diplomatic alternatives do you propose?
I'm afraid that the United States of America stands ashamed for vetoing a ceasefire in a case where more than 17,000 people have been killed, as explained by Professor Haider Eid. This is nothing. This represents the collapse of international relations and keeping Israel accountable for its heinous crimes, and as the Cabinet of South Africa described, a Holocaust against Palestinians, a genocide against Palestinians, a crime against humanity, the crime of apartheid by Israel. There is very little diplomatic maneuvering within the Security Council if Israel is being appeased all the time. It reminds us of Germany just before the Second World War, where Chamberlain tried to appease a fascist regime. And we must stop it, and we must stop it in its tracks. And a diplomatic solution seems to be a distant dream. And we must find other mechanisms, boycott, divestments, and sanctions against the Israeli regime, which is openly fascistic. And the great misfortune is that here in South Africa, we have groups similar to what we had in the Second World War, the Ossewa Brandwacht, which is akin to the Zionist groups that we have in South Africa. And we need to stop that kind of fascist propaganda that was perpetrated then and peddled then in South Africa as it is being peddled now. It's shameful that we can have a situation like this, and the South African government needs to act on the local gauleiters of fascism, of Nazism, of a genocide in South Africa.
Rolene, let's get you into the conversation. From the SA Zionist Federation's perspective, why does Israel oppose an immediate ceasefire, and how does it envision diplomacy as a path to lasting peace there?
Well, first of all, I'm sitting here in Modi'in in central Israel. I'm actually in my bomb shelter because we are still having rockets fired from within the civilian infrastructure in Gaza, which was exposed yesterday in the humanitarian zone. Rockets fired from Gaza to within our civilian infrastructure in Israel, which is a double war crime. From our perspective, the reason why you can't have a ceasefire with Hamas, whose charter calls for the extermination of Jews, not just in the state of Israel, but around the world, which is a Holocaust, and would caution your other guests not to appropriate the Holocaust, the genocide of over 6 million Jews for his political purposes. But nowhere in that call for a ceasefire does it mention the crimes against humanity of the 7th of October, where Hamas terrorists, Hamas, an internationally recognized terror organization prescribed by many countries in the world, including the United Kingdom, infiltrated Israel and murdered, mutilated, tortured, and raped Israeli civilians, taking over 240 hostage, including South Africans. It would be a great breakthrough if we could engage in some kind of diplomatic solution. But how do you negotiate with Hamas, a terror entity that is sworn to the destruction of Israel and the extermination of the Jewish people? They are a terror organization. We have also heard from Palestinians speaking to Al Arabiya, speaking to Al Jazeera, saying that Hamas is taking the humanitarian aid that is destined for them. And let's talk about the issue of genocide. The Israel Defense Forces, which no army in the history of warfare has done, has published a grid giving Gazans the areas that are much safer than the active combat zones. They have dropped millions of leaflets, phoned people, SMS'd people, and engaged in humanitarian corridors, while Hamas, and this is on camera, and this is by the admittance of people in Gaza, have shot them as they are moving down the humanitarian corridor. If anybody sincerely cares for the Palestinian people and the Israeli people, because there are both civilians in both countries that are at stake here, we would be able to talk about a diplomatic resolution. And South Africa, with its history of conflict resolution, would be ideal to engage in this. However, when you bring terrorist organizations, delegations, it not only alarms many in South Africa who I don't think support a terror organization like Hamas, and would prefer to see a peaceful resolution, something that a movement like boycott, divestment and sanctions is actively opposed to, because they don't believe in political discourse. They don't believe in building bridges. How do we move forward from there? So the aim is, and it is agreed upon by many in the region, even if they don't actively say it, is to eradicate Hamas, so that the people of Gaza do stand a chance. And with regards to Gaza being an open-air prison, I don't know any prisons that have a beach line, that have tunnels, that have the ability to fire rockets and infiltrate their neighbors, form a terror enclave, keeping the people there as prisoners of terror, as well as keeping the people here in Israel as prisoners of terror. No Israeli wants to see any Palestinian civilians suffer. This is a war we did not want. This is a war we did not ask for, and this was a war forced upon us and the civilians of Gaza on the 7th of October.
Dr. Chikte, with the escalating humanitarian crisis in Gaza,
I just want to correct a couple of things what Frau Rolene Marx is saying, which would put Goebbels to shame, right? Goebbels, in his propagandistic ways in which he justified Nazism in Germany against the Jews, wouldn't have gone to the depths that Rolene Marx is going into now. What a shameful account. And this is Rolene Marx, who calls herself a journalist. She's in a double bunker. 77 journalists have been killed. They weren't afforded to be in a bunker and to be protected, deliberately targeted, because they spoke the truth and because it will enable Rolene Marx to be a spokesperson for genocide in this world. It's untrue to say that the Israelis don't want to harm the Palestinians. The minister, Netanyahu, the prime minister said it. The minister, they wanted to eradicate, they wanted to bomb Gaza back into the Stone Age. They starved the population. They denied them water. They bombed mosques, hospitals, killed babies everywhere around, in hospitals, everywhere around Gaza. And it is not a war on Gaza. It's a war on women and children. It's a war that is not only taking place in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. The killings there in the West Bank and in the Greater Palestine has been going on since 1948. It's untrue to say that these are terrorists. These are liberatory fighters, and they have every right in terms of international law to resist an occupation that Rolene Marx defends. And how on earth can she say with a straight face that and ignore the atrocities that is occurring in that part of the world? She represents an organization which supported the death penalty for Nelson Mandela, who was called a terrorist. She belongs to an organization which supported that and collaborated with Israel at that time. And so, you know, Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist. Hamas is not a terrorist organization in South Africa or designated as a terrorist organization at the United Nations. The false accounts that she gives, the fabricated accounts she gives, that's one of the reasons why she was expelled from the South African Press Council, the journal of which she is a so-called reporter. The false accounts that she did, the South African Press Council expelled the South African Jewish reporter because they failed to represent the truth. They falsely alleged that others are anti-Semitic, and she is going on the same kind of trope that the Zionists have propagated all the time. The death of babies, the killing of babies, the beheading of babies, even Biden's aides have backed down on that. Read the Haaretz, read the Israeli papers to say who bombed the Nova musicians and people who attended that musical conference. Who bombed them? The Israeli Apaches themselves bombed them. Who killed most of those persons? It is the Israelis who have done that. And to say that Hamas is responsible for that goes against the grain of what is happening. Hamas was here, and they gave us account.
Dr. Chikte, I'm going to come in there, Dr. Chikte. For the sake of Dr. Chikte,
churches have been bombed.
Dr. Chikte, we will not allow this conversation to degenerate into a shouting match, unfortunately.
Please, don't be it may be true that you are not. It may be true that you are not a paid propagandist of the Israeli regime, but what you say unpaid, there is no need to pay you.
Rolene,
I'd actually like to respond to the real-time Holocaust denier, who I'm sure won't mind a libel suit and is quite happy to talk about his freedom rapists and freedom butchers. And the White House aides have backed up every fact, as have forensic pathologists, as have burial societies, as have independent journalists, including South African journalists, who sat and watched the footage in real time.
Let's end this conversation here. That's Rolene Marx as well as Dr. Usuf Chikte. Of course, this being a highly emotive matter, and unfortunately, a conversation there degenerating into what has become a shouting match between our guests.